That's an interesting question. Karsten Mueller says, if you could travel in time, would you go backwards to see how they built the pyramids, for example, or would you go forward in time to see what comes next or how things develop? That's actually a great question. I think I'd obviously, given my mindset, I'd actually prefer to go forward. Maybe people thought I was going to say I would prefer to go backwards. All the people I'd like to meet are in the past. There's nobody in the future I want to meet yet. The interesting thing about that particular question is, if you're talking about time travel, I'm an enormous love of history, huge history fan, and I'm also a big science fiction fan, so I'm kind of torn. But I think when you really get right down to it, if you want to travel into the past, you can do it with books. You can do it with books, and you can get pretty close to the sensations of being there. One of the best novels I've ever read, I don't know if I've mentioned this on the show before, but for God's sake, go and get it. I loved 300. I got a chance to meet Frank Miller. He's a terrific guy. I thought the movie was terrific. I didn't see the sequel. I heard it was just awful. But I thought 300 was great. And I knew the story of Leonidas and the stand at Thermopylae, but I didn't know it very well. I just knew the basics. But as in the case of many things, I saw the movie, then I went out and started doing some reading. So after I saw 300, I read a book called Gates of Fire. And Gates of Fire was about Leonidas and the stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae. And Gates of Fire is a spectacularly, brilliantly written novel. It's not a history book, it's a novel. It's about a guy who's kind of an apprentice. I guess he's sort of like a squire to a knight kind of thing for one of the soldiers in the battle. And so he's actually not a real Spartan, but he wants to be. And he's the sole survival of the battle. He tells the story in retrospect. But I'm embarrassed to say the guy's name, the guy wrote it, Stephen something, has left me. It'll show up in a few seconds in the comments section. I had a chance to interview him and meet him in person, actually, and just tell him how much I liked his book. But the great thing about a great writer is that in the case of Gates of Fire, you had a guy who had two critical elements, and this kind of goes to what we talked about a minute ago on what makes a great science fiction story. On one hand, you had a guy who, like Victor Davis Hanson, Stephen Pressfield, thank you very much, Matt. Stephen Pressfield had the qualities that make Gates of Fire a time travel experience. And here are the two qualities. On one hand, you have to have the kind of left brain academic desire and burning curiosity to really research it. And not just in a superficial way. We talked about this last time with the Ring of Truth and stuff. He had to really research it, understand the formations, the tactics, understand the topography, the history of the battle, understand Spartan society, understand the slave culture, understand the neighboring communities and the wars that went on. I mean, you had to really get deep into the subject matter and accumulate all of the sort of pedantic historical work that other people have done. And that's critical. But the other thing you had to do, in the case of Stephen Pressfield, was you had to be enough of a great storyteller, enough of a great novelist, so that if he was writing something like a Sam Spade detective story, or he's writing any other kind of fiction, it's a combination of those two things. It's the combination of those two. It's the ability to do the research on such a deep level that when he wrote the story, he could write it in first person as if he was there, because on some level, Stephen Pressfield was there. And so Gates of Fire is time travel. If you read Gates of Fire, I can't recommend it highly enough. There's really only 3 or 4 battles. A lot of it's the culture and getting to the battles. But there are 3 or 4 battles in Gates of Fire, culminating in the battle at Thermopylae. But there's one earlier. And he gets into this sense of how the Spartans talks about their weapons and their tactics, and he talks about how they would basically lock their shields and get together, and you'd be 2 or 3 men deep, and what it was like to be underneath those shields, just with your sandals pressing against the sand, and basically just pushing the enemy forces back with their long spears that the Spartans had, and just pushing guys back and talking about things how as you began to advance, it got slipperier because of all the blood on the sand and on the ground. And honestly, it's just astonishing. So the first half of your question, I would have to say, Karsten, is I would say if I had a time machine, I'd go forward, because you can go back. On some level, you can go back. And needless to say, there's a lot of things I'd like to see with my own eyes, including the Battle of Thermopylae. But my curiosity is much greater in the other direction. I don't have... there's not much about the past that I can't find out about. The future, of course, is a big mystery. And I used to love the idea of traveling into the future. Today, I'm not so sure. And the question is, how far? Some of the interesting things about traveling into the future is you start wondering how long the artifacts... First of all, you wonder how long this civilization will last. How long America will last as a country, as a leader of the world. How long it will survive as an actual political entity. How long civilization will last. Will we go up and out into space? Will things just collapse and, there'll be 500,000 humans living in huts grunting at each other? Nobody really knows. I think the one thing you can probably say with some certainty, although it's not very pleasant, is that given geological timescales, it's likely that we won't be here forever, although we might be the first species to beat that. If we stick to our higher callings, we may actually be the first species to actually just sort of break off of the earth and so on. But actually, time travel into the future is fascinating and a little scary. And the question is, how far do you go, and how far would you go? And especially, would you go if you couldn't come back? Because there's a whole subset of science fiction that is about that kind of one-way time travel. And the one-way time travel basically comes down to you're in a hibernation sleeper cell on a sleeper ship, or you go someplace at relativistic speeds, or you're trapped in a cave with a mysterious gas. And that kind of time travel into the future means that you don't have a machine. You simply go to sleep in the present, and like Buck Rogers, you wake up in the future, and there's no coming back. So if you had a chance to do that, rather than, obviously if you got a little dial, you just dial it in, go back and forth. But if you could only go into the future for a certain length of time, how far would you go? I don't know. I'd actually be kind of curious to see what things look like in 150, 200 years. I think if you go much further than that, you get so far out of your culture that it's not even really interesting anymore. You might as well be going to, study people in the Amazon. But it's an interesting question. Let's see, moving on.